Good morning to all of you. First, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for the Advanced Study of India, the Political Science Department, and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity, Race, and Immigration for their material support in making this symposium happen. I'd also like to thank the wonderful staff of my department, the Department of Africana Studies, as well as the Center for Africana Studies, for being their usual awesome selves in making the symposium a reality and not just an idea. And last, certainly but not least, thanks to the symposium participants from near and far, as well as our audience, who braved sleet and snow to discuss the antinomies of democracy today at the University of Pennsylvania. Hopefully they'll come in a little later. All right. To start off, several people have asked me in the months leading up to this very moment, what are democracy's antinomies? Or even more generally, what defines or what does antinomies or its plural antinomies and mean? In Webster Merriam's definition, we first find this as the following definition, followed by the deployment of a term in a sentence. So first the definition. A contradiction between two apparently valid principles or between inferences correctly drawn from such principles. And now the sentence. A fundamental and apparently unresolvable conflict or contradiction. Antinomies of beauty and evil, freedom and slavery. The last part of this sentence largely encapsulates one of the key antinomies of democracy that will be under consideration today. Over the past several years, a cottage industry of sorts has emerged with books, conferences, and pundits offering requiems and funerals for democracy in the contemporary world. As if the current array of center-right and far-right politics in their institutions, ranging from Donald Trump, Theresa May, Vladimir Putin, and Matteo Salvini, are now democracy's pallbearers, lugging its political remains in a pine box and laying it down gently in a freshly dug grave. Yet democracy's antinomies, in my view, and in the view of many participants at this symposium, have long persisted before the contemporary moment. The most obvious antinomy that I mentioned earlier is the relationship between democracy and slavery, which can be traced back to classical Athens. Coerced labor provided a means by which lowercase democrats, the people as it were, not in a contemporary sense, could participate actively in the polis of classical Athens. Slavery allowed citizens to be freed from the dictates of labor for their material well-being. Gendered and ethno-national distinction also made their appearances in the form of law, custom, and amendment in both classical Athens, but also in the very first democracies in modern politics, Britain, France, and the United States, and even in more recent versions across the Americas and Africa, as well as other parts of the global South and North. Here we're going to explore democracy not only as a concept and ideal, but as a practice, a particular combination of norms, institutions, and actors. One of the key themes this symposium explores is how the practice of democracy can generate political inequality. The unequal relationships within a democratic society can reveal much about democracy's contours and the limits of its horizons. Democracies have always maintained a sharp distinction between members of their societies, that is, the people who simply live there, and the members of their polities, the people who hold formal political membership. As democratic institutions maintain barriers to civic membership, they also must justify their exclusions. Moments of geopolitical crisis, such as that experienced by the Greeks during the Greco-Persian Wars, to the current crisis on the southern border of the United States, or the contemporary debate in Germany and the EU more broadly over migration, reveal popular and governmental anxieties about being overrun by certain, not all, foreigners. Citizenship then becomes associated with particular types of people, and not the actual exercise of citizenship rights, duties, and responsibilities. Athenian democracy, as well as modern democracies, do not and have not evolved in isolation, but in relation to other forms of social organization and administration. Tyranny and oligarchy, corporations, amassed significant power and wealth, which has threatened to undermine the practice of democracy. Territorial expansion and the subjugation of non-Athenian or non-U.S. or other populations, along with the threat of invasion, also influence how democracy and, most importantly, differential citizenship regimes developed. The seemingly straightforward genealogy that reduces democracy to its formal and performative elements ignores how coercion, empire, and forced labor have been deeply intertwined in democratic experiments. Why is all of this important? Not only for scholars, but for citizens and non-citizens alike, wherever they may be. Because even a cursory glance at much of Western political theory, philosophy, and political science scholarship devoted to the study of democracy would lead many to reasonably conclude that slavery, racial slavery, and related forms of domination and subordination bear little or no relation to the practice of democracy. Democracy is indeed in need of significant repair, but if such political and moral work is to be done, we need to understand what ails it, what other non-democratic elements grumble in its underbelly. Today we have a diverse, disciplinary and otherwise group of scholars, specialists from several disciplines and fields, who will consider the general motivating questions for the symposium on their own, but also in relation to other scholarly and disciplinary preoccupations, ranging from students of classical Athens, 19th and 20th century France and the EU, Indonesia and oligarchy, racial attitudes and behavior in the United States and the EU, Latin American territorial politics and indigeneity, nationalism and xenophobia. I'm really excited about this gathering of world-class scholars and intellectuals coming together at Penn to explore this important topic. Now, before I close, some housekeeping rules. Presentations will be strictly limited to 25 minutes, allowing for 15 minutes of commentary by panel moderators and 20 minutes of discussion engagement with our audience. We will break very briefly between panels to allow for the change of panelists or a quick move to the loo or to get some coffee. And have a break for lunch. We will have a private lunch for conference participants and encourage all of those in the audience who are neither participants in the conference nor members of the Africana staff to explore some of the many culinary options in the immediate vicinity of this Perlman building. Panel one consists of Jeffrey Winters, longtime colleague and friend, Department of Political Science, Northwestern University, Demetra Kasimis of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Professor Winters is a comparativist who has examined Athenian democracies, complementary relationship to slavery and political exclusion. Professor Kasimis' recent book, I think you might have changed the title, but Metic, that's what I figured, explores the complexities of membership in Athenian political community and the development of autochthonous criteria to exclude women and foreigners from the category of citizen. So thank you all for coming and look forward to the first panel.
That's the thing here. Okay.
So should I just go ahead and you
have the choice to speak from here or from up there.
we'll go up there?
So they're recording up there. Hi.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with everyone. I think I'm going to amplify and build on actually a lot of the things that Michael Hanchard just mentioned. The title of my talk is The Metic In and Out of Theory, and it's drawn from the book that I more or less from the book I published a few weeks ago. Not unlike contemporary democracies, the democracy of classical Athens had a large population of immigrants. But in the period right after the Persian Wars, in the first half of the 5th century, thousands of people, and this is sort of unprecedented, the thousands of people from other parts of Greece and the Mediterranean, from places like present-day Syria and Egypt, sought residence in the polis. Migrants had, of course, been settling in Athens for years. So what's worth underscoring is not simply the unprecedented number of people immigrating to Athens in this period, but the fact that a democratic regime moved for the first time to establish a formal institution for regulating and classifying immigration and for restricting the participation of these metics in civic life. So democratic citizenship in this period depended on having two Athenian parents. The polis classified resident foreigners, manumitted slaves, who were necessarily non-Athenian, in other words, foreign, and their Athenian-born children, so people born in Athens, as metoikoi, or metics, and restricted them from acquiring citizen status on the basis of blood. It's important to state at the outset, though, that metics were free and participated in the democracy's civic life through military service, sophistry, trade, speech writing, religious worship, which was considered a civic practice. So ways, in other words, that not only distinguished them from slaves, but also linked them to aspects of citizen activity and enabled their integration and potential prosperity, informal political influence, and in times of crisis, a kind of suspiciousness and accusations of their passing as citizens. A couple of decades before the Peloponnesian War, in other words, Athenian democracy created the immigrant as a distinct, legal, and heritable category. What concerns me this morning, though, is a puzzle. Historians have long acknowledged the ubiquity of these metics in the life of the Athenian polis. Critics, however, have been reluctant to see, let alone to analyze, the metic as an object of political or theoretical concern. In other words, as a question for politics or a matter of concern in the texts of the period, the tradition of criticism, in other words, that constitutes the so-called foundation of Western political thought. I'm interested in this strategic overlooking. Overlooking, in other words, in texts like Plato's Republic, which I'll mention a little bit later, is set entirely in the home of a metic, and what the relationship between that setting and the questions about justice and membership that this might suggest or open up. So I'm interested in what it might reveal about the questions we do or don't want to see at the origins of democracy and democratic theory. The practice of treating works of classical Greek thought as investigations into various questions of democratic politics today is so customary as to provoke curiosity about the difficult contemporary aporias, or the antinomies, if you like, that remain studiously overlooked in this enterprise. How democracy orders its immigrants is one of these questions. The importance of this shifting hierarchical relation to some Athenian thinkers and the strange unwillingness by theoretically minded critics to see this dynamic as a live issue for classical theories of democracy is my concern this morning. I'm going to argue that immigration politics, or metoikia, are a fundamental matter of investigation in the political thought of classical Athens, and that this metic dimension of democratic life is a critical interpretive field for reading Athenian texts and their arguments about the meaning and practice of democratic citizenship. The metic's restoration as a site of discursive meaning, or symbolic meaning, unleashes new and unexpected critical energy from Athenian political thought because it animates a strain of criticism in which ancient thinkers are wrestling deeply with democracy's constitutive relation to nativism and its ambiguous, even paradoxical effects. So despite a long-standing turn to alterity across the humanities and social sciences, one figure of particular, and I would say of utmost significance for the definition of citizenship, has generally failed to incite political or theoretical interest in its own right. And one reason for this is that the metic's unique and precarious proximity to the citizen makes its signification easy, if not strategically useful, to overlook, and all the more crucial to animate. Because when Athenian texts draw on metic characters, spaces, and activities, they are exploring the meanings and effects of this strategy of inclusion and exclusion. They see and stage a conflict between metic's formal disenfranchisement and their social and economic integration as a way of exploring a deeper tension in the Athenian conception of membership. Is citizenship a particular way of acting made possible by living in the polis, or simply the possession of a legal status that's inherited by blood? If it's the latter, then what political significance does the much celebrated practice of Athenian democracy, or citizenship, I should say, actually carry in the polis? This is another way of saying that an exploration of the meaning of the citizen in classical Greek political thought that, of course, inspires a lot of contemporary democratic theory must include an interrogation of the place of the metic, because the blood-based distinction the polis uses to distinguish citizen from metic insinuates that an unbridgeable constitutive gap separates these two relatively free and dangerously approximate figures. When Athenian thinkers draw on the metic, in my view, they do so not to re-secure this assertion of naturalized difference, which is, I think, what many of us might assume because we think of these thinkers as part of an elite tradition of democratic criticism. But I think that they do so to reveal, or we can read the text as revealing the fragility of this distinction and to accentuate the political and theoretical stakes that are raised by it. Their engagements with the metic or metic-like suggest that in a heterogeneous, inclusive, yet nevertheless hierarchical polis, the democratic demand to distinguish a citizen according to a pre-given difference like blood can generate a need for and an acute anxiety around the deciphering of membership activity as either the authentic expression or the disingenuous performance of a natural attribute. Within this frame, the verifying, exposing, and proving of blood can become critical and preeminent democratic activities. But against the democracy's conceit that citizen status is always decipherable, Athenian thinkers, like Plato, depict metics passing as citizens and citizens passing as metics through acts of imitation or mimesis. I see the instability there figuring around these so-called natural lines of distinction, again, not as a complaint about egalitarianism run amok, but rather as the more critical insight that blood is not necessarily an adequate prerequisite for a practice of membership characterized by freedom and equality. And here's one of the antinomies that we heard about in the introductory remarks. So contrary to what the polis promises its natives, Athenian parentage in these texts neither determines nor secures a lived experience of democratic citizenship. Whether citizen or metic, political status emerges as the uncertain and precarious performance of a naturalized distinction. So what concerns critics of democracy, I'm suggesting, is not only the polis's wishful erasure of socioeconomic barriers to citizen rule, which is really what that tradition of democratic politics is celebrated for, or that moment in Athens, but also its simultaneous dependence on creating new forms of exclusion through a logic and discourse of blood, that we have to see these things as sort of emerging more or less in tandem. And yet when political theorists invoke Athens as a model, an instructive model of egalitarianism, they typically leave this part of the picture under-theorized. To insinuate that the polis was, with the advent of democracy, moving progressively away from a kinship order, that its forward-looking core was inclusive and de-essentializing, is not wrong, but it is misleading. Because the portrait fails to capture the extent to which the Athenian demos was, like most contemporary democratic citizenries, still a descent-based order, and it distracts us from seeing that Athenian thinkers don't take for granted this idealized self-conception that this order presupposed. But the few political theorists who acknowledge the blood-based dimension of Athenian democracy, in other words, this fact about classical Athens and immigration politics, tend to use the polis as an empirical example for claiming that the grounding of political societies in myths of genealogical and therefore natural difference, so-called natural, right, is a political fact that stretches back to classical Athens. So here we see it as an empirical observation. But the critical accounting and theoretical investigation of that politics are understood to be strictly modern affairs. So Plato may have politicized the family, as Jacqueline Stevens observes, but there is no evidence that, quote, the question of political membership was a seriously contested concept, unquote, before modernity. So here I think it's worth pausing to consider that nowhere do we find figurations of metics with the prominence or historical specificity that we do in Plato's Republic. The dialogue unfolds in Piraeus, the Athenian harbor synonymous with empire, merchants, travel, importation, and immigrant residence. A metic entreats Socrates to stay and talk that night. His home furnishes the space for the examination, eschewal, and rethinking of the city's membership lines. The site of the famous imaginary expedition to found a just city belongs to a family with no autochthonous claim to rule. Now, in the grand scheme of the Republic's argumentation, this setting is marginally visible. But as a dramatic conceit, it bears a crucial theoretical insight. If in Athens, the citizen is constituted by the metic's exclusion, Plato's dialogue enacts this logic of democratic difference. For the Republic presents the Athenian definition of the citizen against the metic by literally staging a conversation about membership in the house of one. It would seem that without this figure, we could not grasp democracy in its entirety, nor be moved to think it otherwise. So keeping this in mind then, I want to explore some reasons in the final moments and some interpretive avenues for moving beyond the modern fiction that I mentioned before I started talking about the Republic, which is that political membership or kinship, the kind of naturalized political difference I was talking about, was not a seriously contested concept before modernity, and sort of why political theorists want to see the story of political theory as a kind of progressive one. And so I think the way to do that is by considering, just asking, what is at stake finally for political theory and contemporary democratic politics in bringing the discursive site of the metic out of the shadows and using it to activate a series of ancient contestations over democracy's investment in nativist political exclusion. Long before contemporary thinkers began focusing on the inclusion of the non-native, the metic was already raising challenges to democracy. If foregrounding the politics of Metoikia can open a new horizon for interpreting Athenian political thought, it can also shift the interpretive terrain on which membership questions have been formulated by way of the Greeks for some time. So where do we go from here? The Athenian thinkers, I haven't mentioned many of them, but I'd be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. They present the metic as an unruly figure, easy to confuse, difficult to pin down, constantly transforming, and therefore indicative of membership politics more generally. In Euripides' Ion, Plato's Republic, Demosthenes' court speeches, we find characters or real historical figures who found their citizenship in question, their political standing only temporarily established by a discursive act. The interpretation of a performance, the claiming of ancestry, the taking on of a secret, the analysis of their labor as servile or not, as foreign or not. So each of these doings attempts to conceal, and so it ends up exposing the democratic need and daily attempts to fix meaning and impose order on performance, on what is dynamic and in play. These texts remind us of the vicissitudes of political life: regime change, economic collapse, immigration legislation, war, territorial transformations that can suddenly reveal the precariousness of all membership categories. So if a moment ago I called into question the modern fiction that renders contemporary theorists alert to forms of exclusion that Athenian theorists have a strategic investment in not seeing, let me end now by turning that fiction on its head. What if Athenian engagements with the Metic actually reveal impasses in contemporary thinking about membership instead? Perhaps what is needed now is to envisage Athens not as a model or antiquated ideal, but with Cornelius Castoriadis as a germ, an index of actual possibilities that we engage in discourse and allow to question us. Thinkers writing on contemporary immigration often see the task of political theory to provide prescriptions for or against the extension of citizenship to irregular residents, weighing, for example, whether a country like the United States should provide those living without resident status the legal authorization to stay. These important discussions often evaluate criteria for citizenship and practices of admission to assess their legitimacy, fairness, or consistency with democratic principles. But focused on settling questions of illegality and immigrant amnesty, much political theory recognizes and endorses clear demarcations between citizens and aliens, and so it upholds the conventional boundaries between insiders and outsiders rather than directing attention to their persistent ambiguities. Now, given this picture of political theory, it is not surprising that Athenian engagements with immigration have yet to materialize in contemporary political theoretical discussions. Because Athenian texts don't issue recommendations for membership, and they don't assume that democratic hierarchies are permanently eradicable. But in not doing these things, they do something else. They figure an altogether different way of theorizing that imagines the immigrant, no less the citizen, not as a question to solve, but as an endless aporia for political life. They resist standard notions of the citizen as a fixed status, a legal category, or a changing essence. They offer in its place the Metic, a dynamic and shifting concept conducive to political anxiety, but also of political contestation, and best, though never definitively, imagined along a spectrum of membership rather than on one side of an opposition. They insinuate that the lines between citizens and aliens are impossible to settle once and for all. They denaturalize relations of power so as to reveal their availability for alteration, manipulation, and strategic adaptation. One may therefore interpret the problem of so-called immigrant illegality today as a peculiarly modern predicament that bears little resemblance to the Metic politics I've been describing. The physical borders of the nation-state are generally taken to be categorically different from the impenetrable, because interior, borders that divide members along kinship or ethnic lines, as they did in Athens or at earlier moments in US history. Today, exclusion from full membership appears to rest on a physical and legal transgression, not on a pre-given difference. Any racialization of juridical inequalities appears in this frame as merely coincidental, and so on. But to draw these conclusions would be to turn our backs on the Metic and the challenges that this figure presents. Democratic difference takes multiple guises. Its constituted character is frequently disappeared, and it mutates tactically. From blood to metal, autochthony to labor, kinship to wealth, political difference is called forth, figured, or enacted in the philosophy, oratory, and dramatic poetry of classical Athens so as to propagate the semblance of a prior offense, of, say, passing or inadequate blood that it is supposed merely to evince. Whether we have in mind a border crossing, an invitation from Pericles, or a mixed marriage, what classifies the non-citizen is neither nature nor necessity, but a rule of exclusion, as Etienne Balibar writes, of visible or invisible borders materialized in laws and practices. Now, if the Metic, I don't know, was that alarm for me before? No, okay, good, all right. If the Metic resists easy translation into our vernacular, it is not because the concept is obsolete, but because it is troubling. It spans and inhabits the cleavages of conditions we have long desired to see as dueling and discrete, the foreigner and the native, the legal and the illegal, the citizen and the alien, the outsider and the insider. Because if the metic denotes both an immigrant and a native-born child of one, then it is an incitement to name, but also to analyze the interrelations that might pertain, however informally, between the internal excluded and the external included of figures of multi-ethnic and multicultural democracies. The nearly 4 million children, citizen children of undocumented immigrants in the US may be fully included juridically, but they are in practice deprivileged variously and unpredictably by their parents' lack of legal documentation. Fear of and susceptibility to deportation circumscribe their access to education and health care. Though not codified by law, the uneven incorporation in the form of racial oppression of citizen minorities in North America and Europe suggests, of course, that neither the present nor the recent history of Western democratic societies lacks examples of inherited exclusion. The recovery of the metic might prompt us to avow the always present, if latent, nativist impulses of democracies. It might provoke us to see connections between various contemporary crises today: the uneven inclusion of some citizens, the proliferation of second-class membership statuses, and the anti-immigrant sentiment that rages worldwide. And it might press us to ask whether the figure haunting democracy is not, and never really was, simply the one Derrida calls the foreigner from abroad, but also the one Aristotle describes as a citizen in a qualified sense. It might provoke a new question: what if the metic is the critical figure of our time? Thank you.
Right away? I think so, yes.
Let me just get my water.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Winters from Northwestern University. I want to begin by thanking my good friend Michael for the invitation to be here. It's nice to see other friends. Tulia, where's Anne? Not here. Oh, okay, she'll be here later. First visit to Penn, and it's a real delight to be here. My talk today, domination through democracy. I just want to preface this by saying this isn't an attack on democracy. This isn't a criticism that there's some other system which is better. It's instead an effort to try to explore the extreme limitations of democracy, at least as practiced. And I'm just going to quickly run through a history of stratification, which I think many people are fairly familiar with, but there's one aspect of very early egalitarianism to stratification that I think is noteworthy. And I don't know how many of you were taught this basic idea that when humans moved around, they didn't have much wealth. They could only had as much wealth as they could carry. But as soon as we became sedentary and had sedentary communities, pretty much stratification arose almost immediately. The story is actually not that. It took 3,500 years after the rise of the first villages for wealth stratification to emerge. And that's an interesting fact because it implies that the egalitarian institutions, principles, and urges that had characterized societies in the earliest times of no longer being nomadic, those persisted quite long. So a battle erupted fairly early on after people stopped moving around. And it was eventually won by a relatively small number of people who emerged as far more wealthy than others. But it took longer than most people thought. Just, just to give you an idea, the very first kinds of inequality were rank inequality, then followed by hereditary inequality, and finally by wealth inequality. And as subgroups experimented over a period of generations, eventually they were able to develop structures of fairly extreme structures of domination and exclusion. What's very interesting about the emergence of wealth inequality in human history is that once it was created, it was the single most enduring economic pattern from Mesopotamia to the present, rarely interrupted, and only then for very brief periods. And what's also fascinating is that tremendous wealth stratification persists across all modes of production and all forms of the polity. So it doesn't matter if the society is agricultural, cottage industrial, individual entrepreneurial, and so on, and it doesn't matter whether we're moving through kingship, sultanates, warlords, feudalism, and so on, all the way up to participatory democracies. The pattern of wealth stratification varies, but is intact. In fact, the wealth pyramid is intact even after greater social mobility replaces rigidly exclusionary structures, such as nobilities, castes, and so on. And in some senses, social mobility helps even to stabilize extreme stratification. So instead of it being one royal or aristocratic group at the top who holds on to power, instead there are people who drop out and there are others who move in. And so membership at the top may churn and fluctuate, but there is always a top. How extreme is wealth stratification in the world? Well, these numbers are already terribly out of date because they're from 2015, and this is moving very rapidly. But in 2015, the blue represents the world. 62 people had as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion on Earth. And in the United States, it was 20 people equals 152 million, which is the bottom half of the United States population. This is also very out of date, unfortunately. This is the two wealth pyramids from 2012. One is the net worth at the global level of the world population, and the one on the right is the US population. Actually, those two pyramids are not dramatically different in contour. 66% of the population of the world has zero wealth, and actually that number includes the bottom 20% who of course have negative wealth, which means they're just in absolute debt. In the case of the US, roughly 15 to 20% also have negative wealth. The number at the top, 1% owns 43% of the wealth. That was 2012. That number was passed and became over 50% 4 years later. Now, this is getting to what I want to now talk about with regard to modern democracies and the notion of domination through democracy. It might startle people to know that Western market democracies are among the most materially stratified societies in all of human history. And this presents something of a puzzle or a paradox. So this is the concentration of wealth is actually rapidly increasing. In the slide I showed you earlier, it was 62 billionaires equaled the bottom half of the population. By 2017, it was 35. And in the case of the US, just a few years ago, it was 20 billionaires equals the bottom 50%. As of 2018, it's 2 individuals in the United States have as much wealth as the bottom half. It fluctuates depending on the market: Bezos, Gates, Buffett. Those three individuals in September 2017 had a combined wealth of 250 billion. By June of 2017, by June of 2018, they had increased to 319 billion, up 25% in 8 months. I'm going to just run. I'm not going to focus on this. I do want to do one historical comparison because I said a moment ago that wealth concentration and the gap between the wealthy and the median or average citizen is more extreme now than at any time in measured history. I just want to give a quick comparison. If you took the 500 richest imperial Roman senators and you compared them to the average or median person in their political community, who happened to be on average a landless farmer or slave, the ratio of wealth was about 10,000 to 1. If you take the 500 richest Americans today, it is 58,000 to 1, so roughly 6 times the wealth concentration today as compared to authoritarian imperial Rome. And if you look at only financial assets, which happen to be the most useful politically because they're liquid, it's 100,000 to 1. So we live not just in democracies, but we live in stratified democracies. And partly what I want to grapple with today is how is it possible to have so much inequality coexist with, and not just coexist, but coexist stably with so much inequality. And the puzzle is, why is it that long-established liberal democracies fail to produce policies that deconcentrate wealth? First of all, should we expect a democratic system to deconcentrate wealth? Is that not even a reasonable expectation? And if we shift from basically being an authoritarian state to a democratic one, should that transition help on issues of major inequality and stratification? So all democracies essentially arise from very unequal societies. The promise of democracy, whether at the popular level or among people who theorize about these things, is the belief or the hope that ending dictatorship is a pathway toward more equality in the society. But it's not just a belief or hope, it's actually rooted in research and analysis. If we think about power concentrations in non-democracies, the few in power naturally, logically, enrich themselves and suppress the rest, and they have the power resources to do so. In a democracy, understood as the dispersion, at least the formal dispersion of power, the many can demand access, fairness, equality, and so on through the radical notion of one person, one vote. And yet, how has this actually played out? Well, two major trends over the last roughly 230 to 250 years. First, there is no doubt that participation and freedom, key elements of democracy, have been rising. So if we look at the number of democracies in the world between 1800 and roughly now, we see a very sharp rise in the total number of democracies. And if I were to show you this by population as well, it would look like a similar picture. More and more people are living in increasingly competitive and free political systems. Democracy within countries, not just among them, but within them, has also improved in marked ways. It's roughly a 250-year-old phenomenon. Universal suffrage across most countries that got started early is roughly 100 years old, but there has been rising inclusion by gender, race, ethnicity, region, religion, class, sexual orientation, and so on. But there's been a second trend, and that is that economic inequality has risen sharply during the same 250 years. And other forms of exclusion have either persisted far longer, than democratic theory would predict. So if you look at this, this is the same period, roughly, as I showed in the rising democracy picture, 1820 to around 2008. This is inequality globally among individuals. So this is the global Gini index, not looked at by country, but by individual persons. And what we see is rising inequality globally as democracy is spreading. This is looking at the world Gini coefficient, but looking at it by country. So inequality between countries has also been expanding as democracy has been expanding globally. So in 1820, the global Gini coefficient was about 0.16. In 1950, it was already 0.55. In 1820, the richest country at the time, Britain, was roughly 5 times the average poor country. And by 2000, the richest country then was USA, and it was 25 times the average poor country. So much equality, so much inequality. These are contradictory trends, and they are puzzling. How can political power shift downward, and yet wealth shifts upward? I'll put another way, why does more political dispersion somehow result in more wealth concentration? So we know that in stratified democracies, which are the only kind that exist, we know that democracies start from various kinds of stratifications. The really interesting question is, why would they become more stratified? Why doesn't democracy deconcentrate wealth as a democratic policy outcome? Or put slightly differently, why doesn't freedom help? I want to offer some provisional answers, and I'm working on a book on this, and I'm spending most of my time today presenting the problem, and I won't go terribly deeply into the answers, but let me just give some sort of provisional ideas. First, I think as we study social systems, we greatly underestimate the durability of stratifications. And many of us have expectations that as you move from authoritarianism or military dictatorship or monarchy or whatever it happens to be, slave society to free society, that what ought to go with that are marked trends toward greater equality. And the story of actual democracies is one of not so much how democracy over time, through its decisions, through its institutions, ought to gradually move us toward more equal societies, but it's one of how democracy itself is repeatedly an adaptation to the stratifications that they emerge out of. That is, the stratifications get built into the democracies in their founding moments or in their original founding decades. One of the most obvious examples is the United States, and the question of why did the founders gather here in Philadelphia to rewrite the Constitution? Why did they do that? As many of you know, there had been multiple calls to gather, to work on the Constitution, to redraft it, to amend it, and every time there was a call, no one showed up. They couldn't get anybody to come. But all of a sudden, folks did show up. And the interesting question is why? The short answer to that is that the folks who gathered here in Philadelphia had concluded that there was an excess of democracy in the United States, that the original system that had been set up was working too much to the favor of the poor in at least half the states. And it was alarm over the way that the United States was operating democratically that led to a convening of a convention, which, by the way, had only been given a mandate to amend the Constitution. As you well know, they locked the doors and rewrote the entire thing and wrote an oligarchical highly concentrating power upward, they redid democracy so that inequality would be compatible with democracy. And that was because the first versions that they played with didn't quite do that. And as they were experiencing those first years of democracy, it very quickly became clear that the first targets of the tyranny of the majority in the United States were the wealthy. Because after the War of Independence, there was a tremendous economic crisis. There was a crisis of debt. And the very first political economic question of the country at the time was, who was going to have to pay the debt? And in half the states that had been captured by the poor in their legislatures, the wealthy were being forced to pay the debts. And in the other half, the poor were being forced to pay the debts. And it was that battle over who was going to have to pay that triggered finally the alarm, including what was going on with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, which, by the way, occurred because that legislature was not captured by the poor. It was captured by the wealthy. And the response there was, if we can't get relief via our legislature and the printing of money and all kinds of other mechanisms to lower our debt burden, we will rise up and be armed. So it was the combination of the two kinds of solutions, either legislatures redistributing downward and putting the burdens upward, or, where that was frustrated, the taking up of arms caused everyone to show up. And the number one theme that everyone agreed on in that convention, whatever else they disagreed about in terms of structure, was that there was an excess of democracy in the United States, and that had to be changed. Those kinds of important struggles in the founding moments, how stratifications get built into the institutions of democracy, are extremely important for understanding how it is that you can have participation and yet structures in place that facilitate or defend stratification and allow it to actually increase. And what you'll find is many, many societies that have gone through the establishment of democracy, followed by the collapse of those democracies and the restructuring of them, over and over, what you find is that the initial democracies went too far in threatening the status quo stratification and had to be redone so that stratification was safe. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Michael Hanchard for having me here and including me in this great conference, and to the other organizers of the events for today. It's a real pleasure to be included on a panel with these two speakers. Jeff Winters is a leader in my field of political science, and his work on oligarchy has contributed a lot to my own research. And Demi's own book, which I've had the pleasure to read large parts of in preparation for today, is, I think, a wonderfully rigorous, imaginative, and subtle reading of ancient texts, as I think her remarks reflected just now. I want to begin my comments with Jeff and his presentation just now. And I want to begin with talking about the puzzle that he presents us with. How can inequality have increased along with democratization? And on one of his slides, he raises the possibility that more political dispersion actually can cause more wealth concentration, that these phenomena are not just coincident, democracy and inequality, but in fact democracy may to some degree be causing more wealth inequality. And that may be right, but I just would like to raise the possibility that there are at least two other potential intervening variables that might also contribute to this situation, and they would be capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. And I think we're still in the Industrial Revolution. We're certainly in capitalism. And both of these might explain why there's inequality. They're both, in a sense, coincident with the rebirth of democracy in the late 18th century. That the world we're in has been democratic, capitalist, and industrial revolutionary. And capitalism, as Piketty has shown, among others, seems to lead to inequality. And with regard to the Industrial Revolution, by which I mean the ongoing revolution in communication and transportation technologies, the dramatic demographic explosion, and the production of tremendous wealth that goes along with that, has meant that there's more stuff to divide. And so thus there's perhaps more possibility for inequality because of the dramatic increase in production. And so how do those two dynamics figure into the analysis? Another set of reactions would have to do with thinking about the frame of comparison. It's one thing to talk about democracy as such and what it does, but it strikes me that debates about inequality today have a lot to do with what's happened within democracies, how a democratic society has gone from having relatively less inequality to relatively more inequality. Comparing, for example, in the US and European liberal democracies, among others, the difference between the 1940s to 70s period, when more so than today, economic gains were distributed across all segments of society, to the 1970s to the present moment, when there's much more severe inequality. And we're familiar with some of these statistics. You shared with us, Jeff, some of those statistics. One would be that CEOs, the average CEO today, makes about 300 times more than the average worker. In the 1980s, it was only 30 times more. Piketty has shown that from the mid-1970s to today, a period in which the US economy has almost tripled, the bottom half of the economic distribution in America has seen its pre-tax real income flatlined, not really grow at all as the economy has tripled. A study from the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2016 has shown that between 1986 and 2012 in America, a period in which the economy has almost doubled, only 1% of those gains went to the bottom 90% in the distribution. 99% of the gains went to the top 10%, and 42% of the gains went to the top 0.1%. And so why has that happened within a democracy? What's happened within the American democracy or other democracies that has led to greater inequality? Haven't there been political decisions such as not keeping the minimum wage up with inflation, or so-called right-to-work laws which have devastated unionization, or the deregulation of the financial industry, or tax cuts that have favored the wealthy? Haven't these political decisions had a lot to do with inequality rather than democracy as such? And I suppose another way to get at this question would be to call for comparisons not just within democracies' own lifespans, but between democracies. One thing that I love about your work, Jeff, is that it reminds us that the Nordic countries are not fully egalitarian. Finland has a lot of wealth inequality, as do all the other Nordic states. And we know that from other work that it matters how wealthy you are in Scandinavia and in Finland. Coming from a wealthy family means you're more likely to go to university, and being wealthy means you're more likely to participate in politics, especially extra-electoral forms of engagement like civic society. Still, the Nordic countries, among others, are much less unequal than, say, the United States in their political and educational systems. They don't have poverty in the same way. They don't have onerous registration laws for voting, which makes participation more easy. And their parliamentary rather than presidential systems arguably does a better job of representing minorities. So there's the differences between democracies, political differences between and within, that might have a lot to do with how we consider resisting the problem of inequality. One thing that you've mentioned as a potential solution that you didn't go into much detail about in your presentation here is sortition. That if we chose people by lot, we might be able to restrict the amount of inequality in the world or its function. And I'm sure that that would be a revolutionary policy change, and one that I personally would support. I think it would be fantastic. But the problem of oligarchy is so severe that from what I know of it, even sortition wouldn't fully combat it. I've been somewhat involved with the G1000 in the Netherlands, an organization that puts on citizen assemblies chosen by lot. And what they've said and what they've told me about other groups in the world trying to use lot is that the wealthier people are more likely to reply to the invitation by chance to participate, have either more willingness or ability to participate because of their superior resources. And what we know about Athens as a society that used the lot, more so than most others we know of in history, is that the Athenian politics were still, sociologically speaking, dominated by the wealthy. That doesn't mean that they totally dominated. They were contained in many respects too, but there was still a sense in which those from a wealthier background were more likely to play leading roles in the conduct of Athenian politics. So how much can sortition even do? And then my last question would be, where does this leave us? If inequality has been one of the enduring features of the world for the last few thousand years, and we know that economic inequality tends to produce political imbalances. Do we need to face something like oligarchy as a permanent feature of our world? Is that what we should be teaching kids when they go to grade school? Welcome to the oligarchic world we live in. I've been impressed by certain comments throughout the history of political thought that have asked us to see economic inequality as inescapably translatable into political empowerment. James Harrington in the 1600s wrote, where there is inequality of estates, there must be inequality of power. And Montesquieu, a century later in France in the 1700s, wrote, it is impossible that riches will not secure power. And Madison, in the American context, in the 1800s, spoke of what he called the ordinary influence possessed by property, his expectation that property as such would give disproportionate impact to its holders in political life. Now, these thinkers were to a certain extent bothered by that. They didn't want extreme inequalities and thus extreme power differentials, but they were also somewhat okay with it. They didn't mind that the people who didn't have property couldn't vote, let's say. But for us in this room, who presumably don't share that perspective and who would be even more bothered by this finding, where does that leave us? Are you in agreement, Jeff, with this type of thinking that wants us to expect and to a certain degree accept oligarchy? Turning to Demi's really subtle account of ancient Athenian politics, I'll begin by observing that I think, Demi, one of your main achievements is to break down the boundary between the citizen and the metic. You clearly established that the metic is a liminal figure between free and slave, between citizen and foreigner, between native and barbarian, between mass and elite, between male and female. And as you say, one of the way you break down the boundary is you both enjoy freedom. It's not that the citizens don't have a monopoly of freedom in ancient Athens. Both metics and citizens have it, which further breaks down the boundary between them. We could wonder maybe if they don't exactly have the same freedom, that civic freedom has this authorial legislating aspect that is lacking in the metic, but still. And another way you break down the boundary between the citizen and the metic is, I think, a really fascinating observation of Plato's that you relate to us, that when we engage in politics, we have to take on a kind of speechifying and form of rhetoric that is alien. We have to assimilate ourselves to a manner of speaking that, for many of us at least, is not natural. And one thinks of Socrates' opening lines in the Apology, his defense speech before the law courts in Athens. Frankly, I'm a stranger to the manner of speaking here. And I think it's one of the virtues of your analysis is that it invites other ways of thinking about how we could break down the boundary between the citizen and the metic or the resident alien or the foreigner. One that occurs to me is there is this kind of paradox that when we restrict civic rights, so not everyone has them, it can lead to the excessive inflation of the meaning of those civic rights. And so if I were to say, voting isn't that important, it doesn't do that much, I'd have very little constituency for that idea in our current moment where not everyone has the vote, where we feel that there's voter suppression and so forth. And so one of the things that suppression does, or differential civic classes does, is it can lead to an exaggerated sense of what an ordinary citizen gets to do. And maybe we're familiar with that with regard to race relations, but I think it also has a function with regard to civic status and immigration status as well. And then, as you suggest, maybe we are more like medics today than citizens. We who have certain liberal protections but somewhat limited authorial capacities to author laws, maybe the medic is more of our model than the citizen, even though there's this tendency to read text from the past with this understanding that we are citizens, and thus our greatest model are citizens of earlier times, full citizens. But my question is, what happens when you break down boundaries? When concepts begin to float into each other, what are you left with? And I want to contrast two different models for the breaking down of boundaries. One is aporia, and the other, in keeping with the title of our conference, is antinomy. And you mentioned both of these. To me, aporia would be a state of puzzlement or wonderment as you engage with a matter that doesn't quite sit still. And I think you rely on this a lot. In your remarks just now, Demi, you talked about the metic as an unruly figure that's difficult to pin down, and you talked about the persistent ambiguities of trying to identify the relationship between citizen and foreigner. And to me, of course, also the early Platonic dialogues are famous for their aporetic structure, that the interlocutors talk and they don't ever decide what the virtue they're trying to understand is, and they're left at a loss, even if they've had a long discussion. To me, an antinomy would be different from an aporia. It can have an aspect of puzzlement, but an antinomy can do two things. It can involve a very specific contradiction, not just a state of puzzlement, but a very specific contradiction, and there can be a potential for, if not the resolution of that contradiction, its transcendence. And so Kant and his four antinomies from the Critique of Pure Reason, in one sense, is aporetic. Kant says, if you want to know if you're free or not, you're not going to be able to do it the way you know that a chair is there. You're going to be puzzled about that. On the other hand, he says it's a very specific contradiction. You have a sense of spontaneity, but you also understand that there's natural causality in the world. And furthermore, he has a way of transcending that contradiction when he suggests that in our moral life we can act as if we are free, but when we engage scientifically in the natural world, we assume natural causation. Another example of an antinomy would be the Marxist theory of the bourgeois capitalist state, where there's a contradiction between the norms of free and equal citizenship and the material reality of inequality, the distortion of private property, and so forth. But this contradiction can be transcended through communism. And I think, Demi, that you employ the rhetoric of aporia much more than you do of antinomy. You say on page 181, and you actually mentioned this exact quote today, again, in your presentation, that the texts that you're analyzing in your book do not issue recommendations for membership, nor assume that the hierarchies in democracies can be solved, but they do figure an altogether different way of theorizing that engages the immigrant, quoting you, as an endless aporia for political life. And when you read Plato's so-called Open Secret, you also, I think, lead us in an aporetic direction. It's a very subtle reading that you do. Just to be brief, I won't go into your argument in its entirety, but just to say you conclude from Plato's account of lying that his point is, quoting you again on 177, to demonstrate that all membership orders, including Athenian democracy, are parasitic on a foundation in quote-unquote nature. And so you're saying that for Plato, he's making the general claim that all political membership regimes need a nature, but it's a nature that's not a nature. It's a nature that's in quotes. And that's a deep and, I think, complex and perplexing idea that brings us back into the realm of aporia. And I suppose my one main question for you would be, are you satisfied with aporias? Is that where we want to be left, with being in puzzlement? Or is there some other aspect of your contribution in today that wants us to try to focus in on a single contradiction, or even more, to transcend contradictions in the manner of Marx or Kant, as I mentioned? And it occurs to me that one of the debates in American politics right now with regard to immigration has to do with whether there should be family-based immigration, where not just your spouse and your children, but your siblings and your parents have a right to come to this country if you are a citizen, or whether, as some reformers are calling for, there should be more economic-based immigration, where economic skills and the economic value an immigrant brings to the country should be more highly valued. And I wonder if here, for example, your meditation on blood and its aporetic aspects might give you some critical leverage to participate in that debate, among others. And if the aporias of immigration and membership and the difference between the medic and the citizen are in some sense based on the ultimate aporia of a border, the arbitrariness of a territorial border or a civic boundary, there are some in the world who call for abolishing those. It's a radical idea. But you who appreciate the aporetic consequences of having these borders, are you open to that, or would you be resistant? And if so, why? But however we understand your contribution, whether aporetically or in the manner of an antinomy, I do think that you are very successful in inviting us to see that the medic or the immigrant is not only an important figure in political thought and our own contemporary political philosophy, but a central one. And so thank you both, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
much time do we have? 15 minutes left? Or?
We could open it up, too.
How about if we open
Yeah.
it up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay.
That's too much.
I have a question for Professor Winters. So, to what extent is some of this inequality conditioned by difference beyond class? And does it vary according to context? That's it.
That's to the point. Usually when you elaborate on the question, you help me answer it by letting me know where to go. So I think it is. Again, if we look around the world, well beyond the United States, we find that the inequalities, I happen to focus on wealth inequality. But it turns out that democracies are quite bad at addressing a range of other inequalities that, or exclusions or dominations. Not all of those necessarily increase, but one thing for sure is that democracy has not been living up to its expectations for delivering the end to dominations, exclusions, and marginalizations, whether they are on the basis of gender or race or region or ethnicity, and so on. So, I mean, Michael's work delves into this, I think, brilliantly, and so there are places in which those exclusions overlap, and there are places where the picture is more mixed. So I would say I do an enormous amount of my own work, not only in the United States, but in Southeast Asia. For me, it's an interesting set of comparisons. But I would say my focus today on the wealth aspect was mainly because that one is the one that has actually been most rapidly moving in the opposite direction, as opposed to glacially slow progress in overcoming inequalities. And I would say that is a dominant pattern. On the question of sortition, to link it to this, one of the things that's so attractive about legislature by lotteries is that, and especially, by the way, I'm following John McCormick, who writes on this, I think, in interesting ways. The way you exclude oligarchs from dominating the lottery system of legislation, of establishing legislations, is you make only the bottom 90% of the population eligible to actually be. So our current legislatures around the world are class biased in favor of oligarchs, even though they present themselves as class anonymous. They are in fact class specific. So the idea would be you can achieve not just class specific, but sortition would instantly have all legislatures, take the United States, and all the states and at the federal level, instantly would be 50-50 men and women. They would instantly be racially representative of the population if it was done by sampling instead of, and then if we limited it so that the wealthy could not participate, it would instantly reflect the more average citizen in the society. And just to give you one example of why that would matter, I would predict that if we had a system of representation, not by voting, but instead by being selected as representatives of who we are in our various roles in society, just think of the difference between what the Securities and Exchange Commission or the EPA does to a corporate criminal. A slap on the hand, a little fine, compared to what juries do to corporate criminals. And the difference is that the SEC has never sort of taken a violator in the market, or the EPA has never taken a violator in the environmental realm and hit them with a $250 billion finding. That's what citizens and people do when they look at injustices. And I believe a legislature run by average citizens would produce jury-like outcomes.
I don't know if I need this either. I'd like to follow up on Reed's question about capitalism and how much this is a story about democracy and how much this is what's democratic about this and what has to do with kind of global weight capitalism. Is even in the system that is just described, you'd have to then think there'd be sort of no media environment in which that, say, ordinary citizens would already have opinions about race, equality, all these other factors that they would sort of turn into judicious, rational people as if they were in some kind of isolation chamber. But voters don't necessarily, just by giving them a chance to vote in what would seem to be their rational self-interest. So I'm wondering how much this sort of idealization of a different political system has to block out the nature of capitalism, a pre-existing history of people having all sorts of ways of discriminatory kinds of ideas, and the media environment that is part of capitalism that reinforces those notions over time. I don't know if that's a question. That's sort of can you say something more about this question about capitalism?
Well, what's good about that is I can sort of go in any direction. I would take any part of that. Thank you for that question. So clearly, this comment made by Jeffrey also, clearly a part of this story, and the part I didn't really focus on much, is that we are an environment of capitalism, industrial capitalism, and capitalism is good at certain things. It produces an enormous amount of wealth. It produces poverty, and it produces wealth concentration. It does all those things simultaneously. But it's not the only system in history that has produced stratifications. It just happens to do it in an exaggerated way. And one of the things that those of us who live in democratic, free, participatory societies tend to forget, because we're accustomed to separating civil society and our political realms. This is quite normal. We forget that the vast majority of our lived experience is in authoritarianisms. Our lived experience, which is every corporate and every workplace environment is an authoritarian structure. That's what we live in. It's not democratic. You don't have voice. It is a dictatorship or an oligarchy in every firm, and that is probably 90% of our lived experience, with the 10% of our political experience sort of being the rest. So we've accommodated ourselves to this propertied authoritarian structure. And by the way, the fact that you're allowed to quit a job, so we're not serfs. You can actually take this job and shove it. And your option is to go to another authoritarian structure and work there. So you do have mobility between authoritarian structures, which gives the impression of some kind of freedom. But we're already tremendously accommodated to authoritarian structures that channel wealth upward by their very design, and democracy as a system of participation is overlaid on and intersected with that. The only question I was raising about democracy is sort of, why is it that a system that is designed, presumably, to free us, to allow us to have participation, why is it so unable to meet the challenges of trying to undo those stratifications? Could we have a more democratic civil society as a result of our democratic political system? Normally it's turned the other way around, right? You have free civil society, and that ought to lead to a free government. But can democracy be a pathway toward a more just remainder of our lives in all of its dimensions? The closest we've come is the union movement. The union movement was an attempt it overlapped between the political and our civil society lives. The union movement was an attempt to try to make the workplace more democratic. That was short-lived. I would say the strength of unions is in decline everywhere, more rapid in the United States than in Europe. But I'm not ignoring the fact that capitalism is a big part of the problem. But I still ask fundamentally, why is it that democracy delivers so little? That's the underlying question. What are the limitations of it?
Yes, so she just mentioned unions. Yes, I'm actually an individual myself in the city of Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I've been a member of the union for 17 years. But I see, the lack of power that it has from what it once had.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think here in America the unions have gotten weaker? And then it also seems like to me that, the people that are head of the unions, that some of them seem to be just as, what should I say, maybe corrupt or ruthless, like the CEOs of the corporation or the employees of, people that's calling the shots.
I think it's a long, complicated answer, but I would say the short version is this. Something happened in globalization such that capital and goods became far more mobile and people were relatively immobile. The result of that was that basically it became much easier to pit people in different places on the planet against each other. And in some ways, if that is going on in a very vicious way, to be a member of a union could actually be a net negative to your job in the United States. If your union was really strong, but capital could move, or goods produced at another firm somewhere that was far more exploitative could easily make it to your market, you're screwed as a highly unionized, highly effective worker in the United States. So we had a period of strong labor unions at a time when that mobility of capital and goods was relatively smaller. In other words, benefited from a less globally mobile situation. So all of the investments of US foreign policy during the 20th century were about making a superhighway, technologically or otherwise, institutionally, for capital and for goods, but absolutely no effort on addressing the conditions of labor globally. That the ILO was nothing, while all the rest of the institutions worked hard to take the other factors in this competition and really expand them. So workers of the world have not united. They're more. This is a tremendous problem. Capital is far more united than workers are.
Thank you. I'm glad we went to this spot. It's something I'm really interested in, worker ownership and co-ops and things. So I'm wondering how you think that would impact inequality if we were able to institute workplace democracy, and then also how this would relate to medics, which I know very little about, but if you think that would be reproduced within organizations. And then also if we can think about medics, not just in who gets to participate in like voting and stuff, but what can be democratized. So in a way, we might all be medics. We have participation in some spots, but not in others.
Well, so I think that maybe I'll try to combine your question with Jeff's comments or questions to me. So, and I'll try to head there after first remarking on those. So I want to think about a little more this distinction between aporia and antimony that you raised as for what critical concepts we want to mobilize. And there's something about viewing the medic as an apparatic figure, a figure that pushes us. So maybe I'm going to answer your question first. That pushes us actually to think differently about concepts that we've taken for granted. So if we think of ourselves as citizens with formal juridical privileges, but in practice, we encounter all of these ways in which we aren't actualizing those formal privileges, then the medic might help us think about, if we think about ourselves as medics, then we might be opening up the boundary between the juridical and the performative, or the ideal and the contingent, or the historically situated. So I think there are these ways of not only identifying what happens with politics on the ground, at the granular level, but also kind of a way of studying politics that is concerned with critique. So the reason I like apparatic is because, well, what's interesting actually, Jeff, about what you were saying is that if you look at the dialogues, they take an apparatic form, the conversations take an apparatic form, which might lead us to identify something as a puzzle that we formerly thought was resolvable or somehow neatly, that it was a neat formation. But these dialogues are also grounded in a particular time and place. And so the kind of puzzlement or bewilderment is frequently making recourse to particularized concepts, historically specific dynamics and operations. And there's something I think really beautiful about taking seriously the dramaturgy, the scenography of these texts that are typically taken as transcending the specific politics in which they're set, because that allows us to actually use theory, which of course, is going to make claims about politics in general or about paradigms, but use those to make interventions, particularized interventions into, and this is kind of to go back to what you said to Jeff, democracy, not as such, but democracy, what's happening within democracy. So there's this kind of moving between those two registers that I think the apparatic does for us. And I guess I wonder whether an antinomy is a way of capturing something that we think actually, it's a contradiction, but that where we're trying to also get at something that we think is aberrant, that we think is actually aberrational. And I think I like the apparatic because it allows us not to necessarily remain in bewilderment, but to think that every time we think we've gotten to a resolution, like let's say economic-based immigration as opposed to family-based immigration, that actually maybe that's concealing another kind of exclusion. And so there's something about the antinomy that I think might come from an apparatic examination, but then that staying within the apparatic mode allows us to see, for instance, that wealth can be a proxy for race, or the notion of what counts as a family is also contingent and constantly shifting, as we've seen with the travel bans recently. And so that's something that you get from an apparatic engagement. It's not applicable in a very obvious way, but it reveals a certain kind of operation that might be recurring in politics.
We have time for just one more question.
Thank you. This actually follows on this last comment. So I was wondering about bringing in the context of the destabilization of citizenship currently politically by the president's attacks on the 14th Amendment and the notion of birthright citizenship. So it seems like that's, in a sense, responded to by some of the moves to retrench a solid and conservative understanding of what citizenship is and what its boundaries are as a sort of defensive movement. Your move towards the medic as a sort of producing these euphoриas and destabilizing a different way of citizenship may point in a different direction. So I was wondering if you could comment on that mode of destabilization within the context of current political struggles and where that aporia may lead us to, as opposed to a sort of, again, conservative anti-retrenchment of the notion of citizenship is already defined
Juridically. Yeah, that's a really great question. So right, so that in the face of a legal transformation, the threat of one, we actually double down on the power of the law or the juridical. We go back to how something is constitutionally defined. So there's a place for that, of course, make recourse to the law. But what that might include, that maybe a more apparetic approach, like the medic, might help us see, is something like, well, here we have, once again, blood trumping birth, actually. So what I mean by that is, okay, if the threat right now is to the children, the native-born children of unauthorized immigrants, or immigrants who might have been naturalized but somehow came here illegally, then what we have is birth in the territory being trumped by blood, right? It's actually about inheriting the illegality of your parents. So I think in that sense, the kind of return to the law, which we already are seeing can shift, might stop us from seeing the kind of the recurring patterns. The sort of, why is it that blood, we always sort of reach for blood in times of crisis to define the parameters of birth. And that's always been, I mean, I think because every liberal society actually is still a descent-based order, that's always available for us to, I think, to mobilize. And the ways that the law actually plays a role in making parentage or kinship seem like a pre-given difference. So I don't know if but I think seeing those two things coming together, blood and the birth, the move to the law actually kind of masks actually the ways those are kind of always playing off of each other.
Thank you.